Welcome to Storytime. I'm pleased to be a part of this Fulton County Library program. I'm Deborah, the storyteller, and I'd like to share some of my favorite tales, animal stories, and an original story as well. So let's get started. Here we go. You know what time it is. It's story time, it's story time, it's storytelling time. I'm so glad you're here to hear some stories. It's starting to get cold outside, and when it does, one of my favorite things to do is to make soup. I love chicken noodle, tomato soup, but my favorite is clam chowder. This is a story about how a meal brings a community together, and it's called Stone Soup. Way up in the mountains, there was a special little village, and all of the people who lived in that village had everything they needed. They were very well off. Well, one day, two travelers wandered into town. They were tired and weary. Their clothes were worn and tattered. Their shoes were dusty and dirty and even had holes in the soles. They were tired and hungry. And when they looked around, they thought, surely someone in this little town would have just a bit of food to spare. So they went to the first house they came to and they knocked on the door. Well, an old lady peeked out, and then she opened the door slowly, and she looked out and said, "What do you want?" Well, the travelers were surprised, but they kindly said, "We are hungry. Do you care? Do you have any food to spare?" The old woman put her hands on her hips and looked at them with a mean expression and said, "No," and slammed the door. Well, the travelers were hungry, so they weren't about to give up. They walked a little further to the next house, and once again, they knocked on the door. And this time, a sweet little boy with big, beautiful eyes looked up and said, "Can I help you?" And the travelers said, "We are hungry. Do you care? Do you have any food to spare?" And the little boy in a nice, soft voice said, "I'm sorry, we don't have any food." And he gently closed the door. Well, the travelers' stomachs began to growl. I wonder what it sounded like. Let me listen to your stomachs. Grrr. That's it. Their stomachs sounded just like that because they were starving. So they kept walking and walking, going to every house they could find, knocking on the door, but they got the same reply. There's no food anywhere. The travelers were a little dismayed, so they sat down to think, and then they thought, if there's no food in this town, we must make our magical soup. So they stood up and shouted, "We are master cooks. If anyone has a big pot, we'll make the best soup, the most delicious food you've ever tasted." Well, it didn't take long. A door opened and out came a large man with a large pot. He said, "I've got a pot. I like to eat. Let's see what you can do." And he gave the strangers the pot. And they said, "You'll see. It'll be the best meal you've ever tasted." So they poured water into the pot, and then they set the pot down on a nice hot fire, and the water began to boil. Well, the curious neighbors had been peeking out their windows, but then they opened their doors and they came out to see what was happening. "What's going on?" they said. "Oh, we are master cooks, and we are going to make a special meal. It requires a special ingredient. It's a magical soup, but I'm sure we'll find that ingredient here." And one of the travelers leaned over and picked up a stone and threw it right into the pot. The people were shocked. They gasped, and he took his spoon and he started to stir. It's delicious, it's nutritious, it's incredible, and it's edible. Oh, but we need one ingredient for this soup. But there's no food anywhere in town. We went to every house, and the reply was always the same. We don't care, we won't share, we don't have any food to spare, said the traveler. I don't think we can make this soup. And he shrugged his shoulders and he was about to walk off. And from the middle of the crowd, a teeny tiny little voice said, I think I might have a carrot at home. It was a little girl, and she ran home as fast as she could and got one tiny carrot from her cupboard and threw it in the pot. Oh, the traveler was so excited. He said, that's it, that's it. Bring what you've got, put it in the pot. Oh, but we need another ingredient. This soup would just really be great if we had a potato. And a deep voice from the back of the crowd said, I think I've got a potato. And he ran home and came back with the potato and threw it in the pot. Well, not wanting to be undone or outdone, each person in the community ran home to get what they could find. One came back with a stalk of celery. Another came back with a bright red pepper. And then there was a leaf of lettuce, an onion, yum, a floret of broccoli, Brussels sprouts, my favorite, and a sprig of spinach. Oh, they all went into the pot. Yum! Stone soup, stone soup. We're gonna make some stone soup. It's delicious and nutritious. It's incredible and it's edible. Bring what you got, put it in the pot. And they did. Every neighbor in the community brought something. And pretty soon they began to pull out tables and chairs and bowls and spoons. They brought loaves of bread and chunks of cheese. And they all sat down and laughed and talked and ate and feasted. But above all, they shared. And as the travelers left, they waved goodbye. And they said, don't forget the recipe. If you want to make it, stone soup, stone soup. You can make some stone soup. Bring what you've got, put it in the pot. It's incredible and it's edible. It's delicious. It's nutritious. And that's the story of stone soup. And you can make your own stone soup, but just remember the most important ingredient is sharing. Stone soup. You can find this story at your local library. Thank you. Welcome back to Storytime. I'm Deborah, the storyteller. When I was 12 years old, I took sewing lessons. It was a very creative skill, and I loved it. I enjoyed shopping for fabric and picking out patterns. And although I didn't make very many things, I still enjoyed learning the technique. This is the story about a man who's a tailor, and he takes care of everybody in town, but he neglects himself. It's entitled The Tailor's Coat. Now I'm going to need your help. Let's do this. Snip, snip, snip. Now you try it. Snip, snip, snip. Now we'll use the sewing machine. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. You can do that. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. Now get out your needle and your cloth, and we're going to go in and out, in and out. You try it. In and out, in and out. Great job. So here we go. Once upon a time, there was a tailor in a tiny little kingdom. He made clothes for everybody in town, but his best client was the king himself. He made all of the king's clothes. Well, one day, the king took notice of the tailor, and he thought to himself, the tailor spends so much time making all of my clothes that he doesn't have time for himself. And needless to say, the tailor's clothes were ragged and kind of worn. So one day, the king came to the tailor and said, Tailor, I have a gift for you. You always spend so much time on me and the other people in town. I thought it was time to give you something special. And he pulled out the most beautiful fabric that the tailor had ever seen. It was a kente cloth pattern, and he gave it to the tailor and said, Tailor, make an outfit for yourself. Well, the tailor took the fabric home, and he looked at it all night long. He couldn't decide what to make. He turned it this way and that way, and finally, he came up with an idea. He got out his scissors, get your scissors, and he went snip, snip, snip. And he got out his sewing machine, and he went rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. And then when it was almost finished, he sewed the last touches, in and out, in and out. And when he was done, he had made himself the most beautiful jacket anyone had ever seen. And he put on that jacket and he wore it. He looked at himself in the mirror and he said, looking good. And he wore it right down the center of town. And he walked down the center of town. And when everybody saw him, they stopped and they said, Tailor, looking good, looking good, looking good. Well, the tailor wore that jacket. He wore it and wore it until he wore it out. But it was such a beautiful fabric, he didn't want to let it go. So he thought about it for a while, and then he came up with an idea. He got out his scissors and he said, snip, 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 rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, in and out, in and out. And before you know it, he had turned that jacket into a vest. It was the most beautiful vest he had ever seen, if he said so himself. And he put on that vest and he looked at himself in the mirror and he said, looking good. And when he wore that vest, he strutted right down the center of town. And when the townspeople saw him, you know what they said. Help me out. Looking good, looking good, looking good. Well, he wore that vest until he wore it out. But he wasn't ready to let go of that beautiful kente cloth fabric. And he thought for a minute. He came up with another idea. Let's get out our scissors. Snip, 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 rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. In and out, in and out. And before you know it, he had made a beautiful kufi. That's a hat to go right on top of his head. And he put that hat on and he looked at himself in the mirror and he said, looking good. Well, he wore that kufi and he marched right down the center of town. And he held his head up high and everyone he passed said, hey, Taylor, you looking good, looking good, looking good. Well, you know the tailor, he wore that hat until he wore it out. But there was still a lot of good fabric left. Another idea. Get out your scissors. He went snip, 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 rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. In and out, in and out. And before you know it, he had made a beautiful bow tie. Oh, he put that tie around his neck and he looked in the mirror, and you know what he said, looking good. So he wore that tie, and he wore it and he wore it and walked right down the center of town. Oh, and when everyone saw that necktie, they said, Taylor, looking good, looking good, looking good. Well, he wore that bow tie until he wore it out. And it was so small, there wasn't much fabric left. So he thought, what could I come up with now? He had one more idea. Got out the scissors, snip, 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 rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, in and out, in and out. And before you know it, he had fashioned a beautiful button. Oh, and he put that button right on the front of his shirt. And he looked at himself in the mirror and he said, looking good. And he wore that button with his chest sticking out, and he strutted right down the center of town. And you know what everyone said, looking good, looking good, looking good. Well, the tailor enjoyed wearing that button, but there was nothing else to make. So he thought, and then the tailor came up with an idea. He said, I know, I'm gonna make a story. And he made this story, and he told me, and now I'm telling you, never give up, never quit, because there's always more to do. And that is the story of the tailor's coat. And you can find the tailor's coat at your local library. My next story is a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't follow the rules. As I was growing up, whenever I went out with my siblings or my friends, the rule always was you leave together, return together. Let's hear the story of Bim Willie and the Zimwee and see what happens. One morning, when the mist was still pink from the sunrise in the sky, 3 sisters from a Swahili village set out to go walk by the sea. Now, the walk to the sea was long, but the older sisters had done it many times before. But this would be the first time for their young sister, Bim Willie. The 2 older sisters really didn't want Bim Willie to go. Tasha, the oldest sister, said, Mama Hawa, this walk is much too long for Bim Willie. And then Titi, the middle sister, said, yes, Bim Willie will be too much trouble. She's sure to get in trouble if we let her go. But Mama Hawa said, if Bim Willie doesn't go, then neither do you. So needless to say, Bim Willie was excited to go on the long walk with her sisters. So as they took the long walk going through the jungle, they could hear the sound of the birds, and they could hear the frogs going, whir, whir, whir. Let's try that together. The frog said, whir, whir, whir. It took a while, but soon they got to the sea. Now, as soon as they got there, the 2 older sisters jumped right into the water. They hit the waves, and the waves went she-yash, she-yash. Let's try that together. She-yash, she-yash. But Bim Willie didn't want to get right in. She explored the water, putting her toes in and walking back and forth in the sand, right at the edge of the water. And the water was tea-lopping at her heels. She played and she played, and all of a sudden, something hit her foot. She looked down and it looked like a half moon, but when she picked it up, she said, a shell, I found a shell and it's mine. She was so excited, she got out of the water and went and sat on a rock. And as she sat on the rock, she held the shell in her hand and she explored it from top to bottom, her fingers moving along every bumpy ridge of the shell. And then she put it up to her ear and she could hear it go, shh, shh, shh. What sound did it make? Shh, shh, shh. Well, she played with the shell for a long time, and she even made up a song, and it went like this. I found a shell from out of the sea, a shell that the big wave gave to me. It's pink inside like the sunset sky, and in it you hear the ocean sigh. Well, she played and sang the song over and over again. And when she got tired, she put the shell down and went to play in the water. Well, time passed, and when the girls noticed that the sun was straight up in the sky, they knew it was time to go home. So they headed for home, and they hadn't gone far when Bim Willie remembered, my shell, I forgot my shell. Tasha said, I knew you would be trouble. Titi said, we can get that old silly shell the next time we come. But Bim Willie said, no, I want my shell now. And surprisingly, the two sisters agreed. They let Bim Willie walk back to get the shell by herself. She was a little afraid, but she went because she wanted the shell more than she was afraid. But as she walked, she sang, I found a shell from out of the sea, a shell that the big wave gave to me. It's pink inside like the sunset sky, and in it you hear the ocean sigh. Well, sure enough, when she got back to the place where she left the shell was there, sitting on the ground next to a rock. But on the rock was a big, old, ugly Zimwi. Its face was crinkled and wrinkled like a shrunken gourd, and his arms hung down long and dangled along the sides of the rocks. And he looked at Bim Willie and he said, Jumbo, little girl. And when he smiled, his face crinkled into a wrinkle. Bim Willie was afraid, and she just pointed and said, my shell. And the Zimwi picked up the shell and held it in his hand and said, sing that pretty song again. And Bim Willie did, but she was afraid and she sang in a teeny tiny voice that cracked and you could barely hear her. I found it. Oh, no, said the Zimwi. I can't hear you. Come closer. And he beckoned with one hand while he held the shell in the other. And Bim Willie continued to sing. From out of the sea, closer, closer, I can't hear you. And as she got closer and closer, the Zimwi grabbed her up, garum, and he picked her up and put her inside a drum he had sitting nearby. Now, this is my drum, and the Zimwi had a much bigger drum, but there was no top on it. And he stuck Bim Willie inside, and then he put the top on and tacked it down really tight. And then he said, now I will have the only singing drum in the world. Every time I beat the drum, little girl, you will sing for me. And he took the drum and he threw it over his shoulder and he began to walk away. And Bim Willie cried and cried, Mama, Mama, Mama. But it was too late. There was no one there to hear her. She was inside the drum along with the shell that he had thrown in. And he threw the drum over his shoulder and was gone. Well, pretty soon her cries became sighs. And the Zimwi walked and walked until he got to the next town, which was surrounded by coconut trees. And he went to the baraza. That's the meeting place. Can you say baraza? He went to the baraza and he told all of the men, I have a singing drum. It sings beautiful music, not gum gum. Fix me a meal, and I will make it sing for you. Gather all of the people to come. And so the people did. They gathered all of the people, and the Zimwi began to play his drum. And when he played, Bimwillie, who was locked inside, sang her sad little song. The people enjoyed the music and they fed the Zimwi, and then he was on his way to the next town. Well, in the meantime, the sisters had arrived home without Bimwillie. And when Mama Howell saw, she said, "Where is Bimwillie?" And Tasha and Titi admitted that they had let her go back to get her shell all by herself. And Mama Howell said, no, you must go find her. And Titi and Tasha, they walked and ran and walked back to the beach as fast as they could. But when they got there, the tide was out and no one was there. The beach was bare. The only thing they saw was a little crab skittering around, saying, "Googa, googa, googa." Let's try that together. Googa, googa, googa. Bimwillie was nowhere to be found, and Titi and Tasha knew that if something terrible had happened to her, it was their fault. So they returned to the village, and they told their father Hamasi what had happened. Hamasi gathered all of the people in the baraza around the mango tree. Night was coming, and so he gave them all torches, and they split up into groups to go look for Bimwillie. They searched and searched everywhere all throughout the night and for many, many days, but they could not find Bimwillie. Well, by this time, the Zimwi had gone to many, many towns, and he had Bimwillie inside the drum. And every time he played the drum, Bimwillie would sing. Bimwillie would spend her days inside the drum singing. That was her only job. And at night she would sleep on a mat and she ate jungle food, bananas and coconut milk and coconuts. And then she would lay there with her shell and listen to the shh, shh, shh of the shell. She got so tired and so bored of singing the same old song that every now and then she would change the words, but the Zimwi seemed not to notice. Well, one day they came to another town and the Zimwi said, "I have a magic drum. It's a singing drum, not gum-gum music, but beautiful music." And he told the menfolk, "Gather all of the people and I will play for you." And so they did. Now, in the meantime, a lady came to the Zimwi and she said, "Bwana Zimwi, do you take fish or fowl with your rice?" And when Bimwillie heard those words, she sat up straight. That was her mother. They were in her village. Oh, Bimwillie was so excited she didn't know what to do. So the food was being prepared and the Zimwi played his drum. And Bimwillie began to sing, but this time she changed the words. And she said, "I found a shell from out of the sea, a shell that the Zimwi stole from me. It's dark in here like the midnight sky, and if you listen, you will hear Bimwillie cry." Well, Mama Howell had gone back to the hut to prepare the food, but Titi and Tasha were there, and they heard the singing. They recognized that it was Bimwillie, and they ran back to the hut as fast as they could, and they told Mama Howell. Well, she called Hamasi and told them of what they knew, and they devised a plan. So when the food was ready, Mama Howell went to the Zimwi and said, "Bwana Zimwi, we need water for our meal. Can you go to the river and fetch it for us?" And he agreed. And while he was gone, Hamasi opened the drum, and sure enough, there inside was Bimwillie. And he picked her up and held her in his arms for a moment and gave her a hug, and then passed her to her mother. Her mother and the sisters took Bimwillie and ran back to the hut. And in the meantime, the menfolk helped Hamasi fill the drum with sand. and they replaced the head. And when the Zimwi came back, they ate the meal. And after the meal, they said, Bwana Zimwi, will you play for us again? And the Zimwi agreed. And he started playing the drum. Nothing. No music at all. By this time, all of the people in the village were laughing. Let me hear you laugh. And the Zimwi, he talked to the drum. Why aren't you singing? Why aren't you singing the song? And all the townspeople laughed so hard. The Zimwi picked up his drum and he went to the edge of town. And when he got there, he opened the drum and he saw that it was filled with sand, that he had been fooled. And back in the village, Mama Hawa and Bim Willie and Titi and Tasha and their father Hamasi, they hugged and laughed and embraced one another as tightly as they could. And that night around the fire, everyone told stories. And Bim Willie, she too had a story to tell. And she passed the shell around to everyone. And they each held the shell to their ears. And they listened to the shh, shh, shh of the sea. And that is the story of Bim Willie and the Zimwi. And you can find all of these stories at your local library. So be sure to go out and get a library card, boys and girls. Thank you. Hello, friends. I'd like to share an original story entitled Jabari in the always busy, sometimes quiet, often noisy room. This story was inspired by some stick puppets that were donated to me by a missionary in Africa. These puppets were handmade by women in Nairobi at a street market. And this is the way that they earn money for their families. So this story is about a little boy named Jabari. Jabari means brave and courageous. And he's a little boy who doesn't talk, but he has all of these adventures with his stuffed animal puppets, with his stick puppets, without ever leaving in his room. And it goes like this. Somewhere around the world, deep, deep in the night, in the dark, dark world, a little boy has imaginary adventures and his mind just runs in circles. His name is Jabari. Now, Jabari doesn't have any siblings. He has no sisters and brothers. He doesn't have many friends, but he jumps and he jiggles and he jaggles and he juggles with all the adventures that he creates. Now, I forgot to tell you, Jabari loves stuffed animals, and he gets stuffed animals for every birthday, holiday, and special occasion in between. And he has them all in his room. But his favorite are his stick puppets. And he lines them up every night on his bed and has adventures without ever leaving his room. And he even gives them names. Now, I'm going to need your help with this story. Can you guys say, who's making all of that noise? Let's try it together. Who's making all of that noise? And can you go, ooh, ooh, ah, ah. Let's try it. Ooh, ooh, ah, ah. And how about this? Rumble, rumble, boom, boom. Now you say it. Rumble, rumble, boom, boom. And can you go, s, s, s. Let's try. S, s, s. Splish, splash, splosh. Together. Splish, splash, splosh. Zip, zap, zoom. You try it. Zip, zap, zoom. And can you roar like a lion? Roar. Ooh, one more time. Roar. Okay, so Jabari makes up all of these adventures with his animal friends. On Monday, he had an adventure with Mutia. Mutia is a monkey, and Mutia means honored warrior. He and Mutia, the monkey, played in his room. They climbed trees and swung from branch to branch, and they ate bananas. And then they went, ooh, ooh, ah, ah, ooh, ooh, ah, ah. And when his father heard the noise, he ran upstairs, and you know what he said? Who's making all of that noise? But Jabari didn't say a word. And his father saw the bananas on the floor and said, bananas are for monkeys, young man. Clean up this mess. And he did. On Tuesday, he had an adventure with his friend Econ, the elephant. They walked across the jungle. Econ means strong, and they were both strong, but that was a long trip. And as they walked, they said, rumble, rumble, boom, boom, rumble, rumble, boom, boom. And his mother heard all of the noise and ran upstairs, and you know what she said? Who's making all of that noise? But Jabari just looked at Econ and didn't say a word. On Wednesday, he played with his friend Saburi. Saburi is a snake, and Saburi means quiet. It means silent. And he and Saburi crawled around the room, up one side of the wall and down the other, and then they hid underneath the bed. And it was so quiet, his father tiptoed upstairs, and when he opened the door, Saburi stuck out his neck, and his father just laughed and went back downstairs. Well, on Thursday, he had an adventure with a hippo named Harambe. Harambe means to pull together, and he and Harambe pulled together, and they walked and they walked and they walked. Oh, they walked so far and so long. They were so hot when they got home. They jumped in the tub and they went splish, splash, splosh, splish, splash, splosh. And his mother came upstairs and said, who's making all of that noise? And it was Jabari and Harambe. And when his mother saw the water, she said, clean up this mess. And he did, but he didn't say a word. On Friday, he had an adventure with his friend Zara. Oh, Zara was so beautiful. Zara means radiant, and Zara was indeed radiant. She was sharp, and she thought no one had an outfit like hers. But Jabari, his outfit was just like hers. They had fun together. They went zip, zam, zoom around the room. Zip, zam, zoom, and had a great time. But his father heard the noise and ran upstairs and said, who's making all of that noise? And it was Jabari and Zara, but he didn't say a word. Well, on Saturday, he had another adventure with Loba, the lion. Loba means to talk. And he and Loba, they roamed around the jungle. And then they went roar as loud as they could. Roar! And both his parents ran upstairs and said, who's making all of that noise? And Jabari just covered his eyes and pointed to Loba Well, his mother and father knew that he could talk. They heard all of the noise that he made with all of his animal friends. So they decided to do something else. And so on Sunday, when Jabari woke up, he rubbed his eyes and he saw something move. He saw all of his animal friends, but they weren't real. They weren't alive. And he looked again and he thought to himself, could this be a real live cat? And he looked and he saw and it moved. And his mother said, do you like it? He didn't say a word. And his father said, let's name it Kabira, which means powerful. And it was a real live kitten. And when Kabira said, purr, purr, Jabari opened his mouth and said, meow. And his mother and father saw, and his mother and father heard, and they were so happy. And that is the story of Jabari in the always busy, sometimes quiet, often noisy room. I hope you have enjoyed Storytime. And most of these stories can be found at your local library. So I want you guys to get your library cards and visit your local libraries and enjoy reading and Storytime. I'm Deborah the Storyteller. Bye-bye. Thank you for joining me. Keep a story in your heart.